I am Jessica Frank, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of panel moderating and then talking a little bit at the end, but I will let my speakers introduce themselves. We do have one remote participant, so she can introduce herself when she gets on, but we're going to start with Stephanie Duke.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Duke. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a tall, slender, Caucasian, middle-aged female with short salt, pepper, gray hair. I am the Disaster Resilience Coordinator and Attorney at Disability Rights Texas. Disability Rights Texas is the protection and advocacy agency in the state of Texas. There is one of us in every state and territory in the U.S., and our job is to help ensure that individuals with disabilities' rights and civil liberties are upheld and enforced across a wide variety of societal domains. I specifically work on disasters and emergency issues, which includes every substantive area of law. So I get to do a lot of different types of work. But today, like we talked about, we're here to talk about, next slide, is accessibility. What is accessibility? It is a legal term of art used in our world, obviously, but it is a right for someone to access, approach, visit, or use. And we see it in property law, family law, copyright, and even disability. So what are considerations that we should be looking at accessibility? Obviously, with my work in disability advocacy, we have Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, and the American with Disabilities Act that focuses on specifically ensuring individuals with disabilities have access, equitable access to employment opportunities, to governmental services, to public places, as well as telecommunications. And while the legal analysis is the same, really it's about ensuring reasonable accommodations are made for individuals with disabilities, but for their disability and what they need to access whatever they're trying to get to. So that's kind of the foundation of what you look at when you're looking at accessibility. The reasonable accommodations initially really focused on specific things, right? Specific things to do to ensure accessibility. Over time, we've kind of expanded that definition, next slide, to talk about meaningful access, right? We talk about the ability to participate in and benefit from, okay? We've seen a little progression in case law and opinions in that, like with effective communication. The accommodation itself is to ensure translation, right? Different languages, ASL, plain language. But it's also about the content of the message. So you've got these architectural or procedural things you may do to afford accessibility, but then you also have to look at the programmatic piece that's going on. So if there's one thing you take away from me at this point, is that meaningful access has to have the procedural piece, the architectural piece, as well as the substantive and programmatic. It's not just about the ramp or the curb cut or accessible transportation to the building or website in our analogy, right? It's what's in the building or on the website has to be inclusive to provide that meaningful access for specific individuals, whether it's somebody with a disability, low income, another underserved population, but that is what affords meaningful access. And we have to recognize that we don't always know. We have to have the humility to bring the people to the table to ask those questions. We're not planning for, we're planning with. And anytime you're looking at implementing new programs, design, development, it should be done on the front end, right? It should be collaborative. We should be asking those questions to the people that know, have the lived experience. I'm not an individual with a disability, and I will screw it up all the time, but I'll know who to go to ask the right questions, right? What can I do to make it better? So that's what we really need to focus on in providing meaningful access. It's the procedural, architectural piece, plus the substantive or programmatic piece to ensure the inclusivity, right? That those issues, those barriers, whatever, are being addressed in developing the legal tools, right? And in our world, in access to justice, those tools that are being produced need to include those programmatic issues as well. So I had a couple little examples specifically listed for disasters. one of the projects we worked on with Pro Bono Net, they have a FEMA appeal generator for individuals who have been denied for FEMA for various reasons. Well, the substantive issues that my clients were seeing after Harvey was that FEMA has one habitability standard. They don't accommodate. So if you're an individual with an underlying health impairment, living with mold or smoke damage is not safe or sanitary, but they were not eligible for FEMA assistance, so they were automatically getting denied. What Pro Bono worked with, not only including some reasonable accommodations, upgrades, and inclusivity in the program, it was also the substantive issues that my clients were seeing to allow for them to access this legal tool as well, Pro Se tool. So that's an example of inclusivity. Another example is something we created for preparedness, and it's just an HTML form, and the whole point is to get people, it doesn't store PII. I would love to, but that's a whole conversation I'm having with my organization and storing that. But it's an inclusive preparedness tool for individuals. It's not an exhaustive step-by-step, but it's like, okay, these are the things you should be thinking about beforehand, right? And asking the right questions to the right people. So it's simple, but it's something we're using in outreach and empowering our community to help advocate for themselves. So, and thinking about just the bigger picture and accessibility, it's about the things that we do, right, and can do. And my colleagues are going to talk about more granular pieces about that, but it's also about the substantive or the programmatic things that individuals are in fact experiencing in whatever societal domain we're trying to help with.
Okay, so we're gonna switch over to Ariadna. If you want to take presenter.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Okay. Stop sharing. We're ready whenever you are.
Okay, Jessica, the presenter view is not working, so I can start presenting myself while you put it back on, and I'm so sorry.
Oh, you want me to put the slides back on? Okay. Let me.
So, hello everybody. My name is Ariadna Godreau. I am the Executive Director and founder of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico. Speaking about accessibility, I'm not there. I've been part of the ITC for some years now because I have a newborn that's going to be joining our presentation. He is 4 weeks old. So he'll be with us, just like sharing this space. But I wanted to say how incredibly grateful I am for having the chance once again to speak about what are we doing in Puerto Rico with accessibility, and also how are we figuring things out when we ask ourselves questions of legal tech relevance, having equitable impact on communities and whatnot. So I wanted to start, if we can have the next slide, I wanted to start a little bit talking about Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico. We are a nonprofit that started working 9 years ago, and we work with a legal empowerment perspective, working specifically with disaster response issues, working with overall access to justice policies, and also working with legal support and advocacy that has to do with housing justice. So we work with mortgages, we work with tenants, we work with disaster survivors, of course, and we work basically to mitigate the consequences of displacements of people basically leaving the island because they can't afford to be here. As part of our work, we have developed several tools that have as a sole objective to socialize legal information, tools as ayudalegalpr.org, that is basically Puerto Rico's statewide legal website. And that website has given us an experience of 8 years, just like developing accessible tools to make it more useful for the people on the ground. And when I'm talking about accessibility in our case, in the case of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, although we have designed specific tools like for the deaf community here, I'm speaking specifically on how can we design tools that socialize legal information, that socialize legal awareness, with the idea that people can know the law, but that they also can transform the law. Part of our work has to do a lot with outreach, because we create a lot of content, because we create a lot of legal information pieces. Besides traditional litigation, we're always trying to put out like in different media outlets. So we use radio, we use social media, and I wanted to share that with you because when we're thinking about accessibility, we're thinking about like very broad terms. If we can go ahead. With the next slide, please. Thank you. And when we are trying to make law more accessible, we do it because we are very aware as a organization that is fully independent, that never receives a single cent from the federal or local governments. We are a non-LSC. That part of our work is denouncing the fact that law tends to be controlled exclusively by legal actors, and that we have to break that down so that people can have awareness of not only their responsibilities but also the guarantees that they have as right holders. When we work with people on the ground, we work with a population that it's like nearly half of them on the poverty levels. We work with high levels of people being displaced. Nearly 12% of the population of the island has left in the last 10 years. And we also work with people that have endured several disasters through the past 6 years. So we have had major hurricanes, earthquakes, of course, the pandemic, and an austerity crisis that is basically pushing people out. So we do it thinking about those people, and we try to create tools that can like break down how close the legal systems are, but also very aware of the fact that when people like encounter legal information, their first reaction is just like to step back because they are very aware of the violence that sometimes these tools like carry for them. If we can go to the next slide. So when we're working with legal tech, and this is something that we have had since the beginning with the idea of making it more accessible, we're always thinking about who is the audience, what is the language that we're going to use, is plain language is enough? Usually it's not. What are the outlets that are sustainable for people like to reach? And I created like a small checklist that I wanted to share with you all, if we can pass to the next slide, with some of the questions that we make ourselves when we are trying to design a new initiative, a new content for people on the ground. And this is like basically a checklist that guides us through the process about how are we engaging people that need this tool? How are we engaging diverse populations that need legal accompaniment, that need legal support? And how are we developing things that are not only like good for us as lawyers or convenient for us as a nonprofit that dedicates itself to this, but also for the people that we are trying to accompany throughout the process. And I wanted to share them with you specifically, not only questions about who's the user, what are the barriers that are not letting them access legal information or access legal support, and how does it look like to win, basically. But we're also thinking about, about what is the tech that's already on their hands and what is the tech that's going to be sustainable. When you start developing like accessible tech, we're always thinking about apps or AI. And sometimes we are like unable to see that low tech, it's sometimes like the best options for people in communities because it's a tool that's more sustainable for them in the long term. And I wanted to share with you like very quickly the experience that we have had in disasters, if we can go to the next slide. So often when, even though we have the experience of some years, we have like the checklist, when things happen on the ground, and a lot of things have happened on the ground besides this baby, like basically what happens is that we don't have time like to sit down with our list and our checklist and think about how are we going to be creating a FEMA form, how are we going to be advocating against FEMA discriminating against Black individuals in regards to assistance. But what happens on the ground, and here you're seeing a house completely destroyed by Hurricane Maria, and more recently, basically a brigade that we made in a community so that people could know and learn about FEMA assistance. What happens on the ground is that we have already like to create some sort of readiness so that when everything else fails, and that includes like having power outages for a whole year, as it happened with Hurricane Maria in the island, the technology that we have developed and the way that we have thought about technology and the way that we have thought about accessibility and legal tech, like gives us like knowledge that can transfer to other areas of service so that we can still be not only relevant, but that we can be truly useful for communities in need. And we can have a next slide. So when we're thinking about, and this is something that I wanted to end us with the fact that readiness is key when we're talking about accessibility, when we're talking about legal tech, and that in our case we have learned that how this readiness looks like. We always have our outreach like tools like ready. We have learned about how to put out information very quickly, not only like in social media, not only in our websites, not only in the apps that we use, but also using tools like radio or using materials that we can use in multiple spaces at the same time. We try to carry out like self-help materials like beyond our websites and beyond the digital toolkits that we create. Of course, like we have like the forms, the doc assembly tools that are very popular, but we have also always been very conscious that, for example, when disaster strikes, we need not only to have like the website up and updated, but we need to have those materials printed out, because in the end, that's how tech making it more accessible looks like for us when we are on the ground. And also thinking about how can we use like legal tech and to demand more accessibility. And in our case, that has meant not only like developing like forms and educational content and radio programs and podcasts, and we have all of that, but also using like things like membership building tools, or using sign up forms, like both like in the digital world and in the real world, to make it more people friendly, or making it more transparent also for the people that we're trying to accompany in the processes. And I want to just like to end this here, because I know this is a conversation, but I just want to like to showcase some of the things that we have been doing so that we can be part of a discussion at the end. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So next we have Luigi Bai from Lone Star Legal Aid.
So good morning, I'm Luigi Bai. I'm from Lone Star Legal Aid in Houston, Texas. I present as a middle-aged male of Italian descent. And after the urgency of Ariadna's presentation, what I'm going to talk about here is going to feel really slow. But I think if these are things that if you practice them, when a disaster hits, you'll have these at your fingertips and be ready to use them in urgent situations. So go to the next slide. Why am I here on this panel? Basically, we've done a lot of work to build self-help tools. There are links on the slide. When you download the slides, you can click on the links. We've built a number of interviews and document assemblies in A to J. I started my work at Lone Star Legal Aid in this space in collaboration with our other two partners across Texas, Legal Aid of Northwest Texas and Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. So together we learned a lot of these tips and tricks. Recently, we've also put together a texting infrastructure program to help people with eviction appeals, and we're now accumulated a lot of different tools in a lot of different legal subject areas, so that we have to keep them up to date. And so we just recently got a TIG grant to try to automate the process of annotating our documents so we know what they're sensitive to, and then being able to check the websites for different statutes or regulations or agencies to give us an alert of, hey, something needs to be looked at for this particular document or segment of your tool. So we have a small team, and so this will hopefully make us more effective. So once you've figured out the substantive part of what you're going to present, and this should go without saying, which is why I don't have a slide for it to begin with, but of course you start by making your content legally accurate and legally thorough, right? You work with your subject matter experts, you make sure that what you're presenting is correct, but then you need to be able to have it accessible to the people that you're trying to reach. And so what you do is you look at the ways that people come to your content and realize that people are coming from a diversity of backgrounds, people are coming from a diversity of skills, and often people are coming to your content in a situation of stress. Even if it's not a wide disaster, for them, they're trying to solve a problem. And so they don't necessarily have the cognitive space to be able to read very big things. So we want to make sure that that they can see themselves in the content and that it's legible to them. And whatever you do, you need to make sure that you're actually testing, as Stephanie points out, with the groups that you're actually targeting and working with. So what are some of the tips that we use? Well, first of all, for those of us who are lawyers and have practiced, you're trying to explain something to somebody who's coming to who's accessing your material, whatever it is, whether it's a website or over text or a written piece of documentation. And often when we interact with clients, we figure out ways of explaining things that are that fit the frame of the people that we're trying to work with. Often it really helps to use the active voice. As lawyers, we use the passive voice a lot, but it helps people, I think, to understand what a process is if they know who the actors are and what each person is doing, and in particular, what are the things that they can do. So using active verbs, identifying the actors really helps people put themselves in the context where they can solve their problem. Be concise and brief. And I'm realizing I'm spending a lot of time on a slide where I'm talking about being brief, but don't try to over-explain. It's not necessary to give a lot of context or background to the law. One of the things that we tested that seemed pretty effective was we could explain something that has a statutory underpinning and then make a link to the statute or make a link to the agency, right? We would give a brief of a procedure and then let somebody who wants to get more information go and look it up. And if they don't, they can proceed with what they have, right? One of the things that testing showed us was it's really important to use consistent terms for the same things. If you call something an eviction in one place and a forcible detainer somewhere else, it's going to trip people up because they're going to think these are different things. So over time, build a glossary, right? Kind of scrub through your documents and figure out how you can not only make each individual piece internally consistent, but try to be consistent over your whole corpus, right? On the other side of being brief, one of the things that helps in plain language is if you have a term of art that somebody just needs to know. If they're going to walk into court and they're going to hear this phrase, give it to them, or an acronym, an agency acronym, or some procedural acronym, but then also give an explanation in common words, short words, plain language. That way, they'll have the context to not only understand what you're giving them in the moment, but when they hear this unfamiliar term in another context, they'll know, okay, this is how I apply this, right? And there are a lot more suggestions and explanations at plainlanguage.gov. One of the approaches that we took in our earliest disaster project was to take a large area of the law, for example, title clearing or disaster-related family law issues, and break them up into chunks. People are coming to our site to solve a specific problem. So what we tried to do is ask them a number of questions to guide them to the next step. And once they accomplish that step, they can always come back and go through the questions and take another step. But what we found was when we started, if you give them a 5-page explainer that has like all of these different situations on it, then they're going to have to look through that and situate themselves in that document to figure out what their next step is. So if you can, try to guide people to really concrete next things to do. Make it easy to find. There are a lot of different approaches with online tools doing natural language searches. Ours was an interview approach. And there are probably other good ways to do that too. And one of the things that we tried to do as part of our process and in all of our tools, like our A to J interviews, we try to give the visitor something to walk away with, whether it's something that is actionable, right? Like a letter to their landlord or to a debt collector or a document they can file in court, or even if it's just like list of next steps, make sure that it has just what they need, right? Usually it's going to be delivered as a PDF. And so it can have those clickable links to the statutes and the agencies if they want it, but try to give them something as part of their interaction. When we talk about plain language and trying to figure out, can somebody understand this? You can start with some good tools. There are tools that will assess what's called readability in English. We've not been able to find really good tools in other languages, and I'd love to learn about them if you're aware of them. So what we do usually is we start with plain language in English, and then we translate to other languages. There are two broad ways to determine readability. And I would say stop me if I'm going into the weeds, but you can't, so I'm going to do it anyway. The first is an algorithmic approach, and you'll see these things in tools like Microsoft Word. They count things like words and sentence length and try to count syllables, etc. Those are good, and they're not necessarily aware of common usage of language. So there may be longer words like insurance that might trip up one of these algorithmic checkers that is nonetheless, a common word. So we have another set of tools. One of them is the Dale Chall analytic tool that has a list of common words. And so it analyzes your text and tries to figure out, which of these words are uncommon, does a calculation, and then says, okay, you should probably mix in more common words. And that's where adding those explanations actually really helps, because it not only helps your viewer, but it also helps, you hit the score. What we did was we use both of those in practice. And then what we do is we record the scores, because each of them will give you a score. And then in user testing, we'll validate those. And then we can get a good idea of, okay, in this area of the law, these scores are going to be better than others. So use your data if you can, right? Record your data, validate with testing if you can. So Ariadna actually touched on this too. You have lots of different ways of delivering content, right? And so one of the things that we try to do is make information available on the web, which is the easiest, right? You can do fact sheets to hand out, although they're typically pretty general purpose. And then we've also tried to deliver information over text and by voice recognition. Not all of these are really that successful in our experience. Shorter things are easier to do over text and phone. And then, longer things, it's probably easier to send somebody to a website where they can do more traveling. But because you're trying to reach people with different levels of technical knowledge, different levels of access to internet, different levels of, the tools that they use, you want to try to make your information available in as many different ways as possible. Thank you. In terms of representation, what we try to do is we try to avoid making content that is really tied to things like assumptions about gender or family composition. This is not something necessarily that we found it easy to independently test for. And I would love to see if anyone knows of studies that talk about the use of inclusive language in terms of accessibility. I'd love to see them. But it's been at least our hypothesis that the more inclusive and the more neutral that we can make our examples, our situations, our discussions, the more likely it is that a visitor is going to be able to see themselves in that situation and not feel excluded. So, we do this in part because we think it's effective. We do it because it's the right thing to do. And we do it because it's an important signal, right? That our organization is inclusive and we're serving everyone that we can, except for the financial, qualifications that people need to have. As Stephanie points out, right, we're not necessarily experts on how people want to be addressed. And it is awkward to be in a room of people discussing how a population might see something or talk about something and have no representatives in the room. So try to include people in your process, as Stephanie says, in your testing, in your upfront. If you don't know, ask. Part of this area is just being open-minded and being willing to learn, admit when you don't know, and make changes. What we're trying to do ultimately is make every visitor, every person that we interact with feel seen. And that may not be totally possible, but we have to keep trying, right? Testing is really important. You've probably seen a slide like this in every presentation at ITC, probably for the past 2 years, right? But you can't, as much as we do this, I think it's a mistake to assume that you're really an expert in trying to make these materials accessible. So one of the things that we did was we put out a Facebook ad. We have a database of over 300 people across Texas that are of have different demographic characteristics, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't include, obviously types of disability, right? Types of ability. Try to go ahead and test your materials with as broad a population as you can. Design your testing scenarios so that you at least have 2 people looking at each thing that you're trying to test. Try not to have like any individual expert sort of say what the thing is, right? Or what the issue is with the materials that you have. Compensate your testers. You're asking them for their time and their expertise. And if you're an LSC funded organization or under an LSC grant, there's an advisory opinion under there that shows you how to do it. What we usually do is we do a first round of testing. We try to get feedback from as many people as we can. We go back and try to make changes. And then hopefully we got it right, but to make sure, we do a second round of really brief testing to make sure that the changes that we made actually responded to the feedback we got.
Do you go back to the original testers or to a
No.
second group?
We go to another group. So we're actually getting at least 3 eyes, on each individual piece. I thought about this slide, right? We've been doing this now since 2019, which feels like a long time, especially with COVID, but it's hard to know exactly what the expert sites are to refer people to. I think ultimately these are good places to start. Talk to other people who are practicing, talk to other people in your community, and just start somewhere, learn as much as you can, practice it, test, and then cycle back and keep doing it. And then, as Ariadna would say, if you have an emergency situation, you've got these abilities and skills and tools at your fingertips. And when you need to produce materials, they'll at least be better than what you might have done prior to this. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Okay, now we have Sally.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sally Chaffin. I am, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a white lady, also middle-aged. I'm wearing a blazer for the first time in several years to appear authoritative, which I am not. But I'm the Associate Director of Community Education and Grants at Atlanta Legal Aid. And as part of my job, I manage our statewide self-help website, georgialegalaid.org, and also our mirror site, our Spanish mirror site, Utalegal, Georgia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more granular tech side, which I would like to say that I'm not a tech person. So I think like many of us here, not most of us, many of us here who work for legal services organizations, we're tasked with a lot of things that are kind of beyond our expertise. And so you just figure it out. And then when you don't have that expertise, you turn to experts. So I'm going to talk about how we audited our website for accessibility to make it WCAG 2.0 level AA up to those standards. So where to start if you are just starting with an accessibility audit? Well, we developed a toolkit, so I have a great place for you to start. Several years ago, Legal Services Vermont and Atlanta Legal Aid, along with a consultant, developed a toolkit for web accessibility for self-help websites. We use LawHelp, and Vermont uses Drupal. So there are a lot of, in that toolkit, there are a lot of very specific things that you can do and examples of how to make your website accessible that I'll touch on, but this is a really great toolkit. It's on the LSNTAP website, so you can find it there. I should say that it is available in PDF form on that website. And if you, if that is like a format that you can't access, which the screen readers a lot of times can't, let me know. I'm happy to furnish you with something that you can use. So what the goal that I'm talking about is, of course, the content, we did that as well, and that is super important, but also people who are using assistive technologies to access your website. And how do you make sure that it is actually working and functioning in a way that people can use your website in the way that you want them to be able to get to the important content that you're putting on there. So, these assistive technologies are using the code in your website. So, and how you present your content on it. So that's the type of accessibility I'm talking about. So, as I said, our goal when we did this was to put it up to make sure our website was meeting the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 level AA. I'm sure there is a better way to say that, standards. And you can, there are 13 guidelines and a lot of very specific points to meet, ways that your website should be functioning to meet these standards. And if you go to the w3.org website, they are very clearly, I found it very helpful, even as somebody who doesn't understand what they're talking about. They give very good examples of how you can meet all of these different guidelines. There are things like the 4 principles is your information perceivable to users? So these are things like color contrast. Are you using alt text for photos? Is it operable? Can all of your content be navigated from just using a keyboard without a mouse? And that's something that if you're wondering if your website is accessible, try that. That is very telling. If you just try to click through just using your keyboard. Is it understandable? So is your design consistent and predictable to somebody who is on your website? Does the same link where it says more info, does that do the same thing every time? Those kind of things. And is it robust? So can your content be interpreted by people using assistive technology and just all users? So go to that website if you want the very specific things to do. So can you have the next slide? We audited our website. We did that in 3 kind of general ways. We did it using free online accessibility tools. And I have a slide coming up next that will give you a bunch of those and then tell you also where to find more. You can see the screenshot is me using a Wave tool, which is a plugin on Georgia Legal Aid. I find this one very user-friendly because it shows you where the problems are, and that is visually for me is very helpful. I'm sure there are so many tools out there and there's a lot of free ones, and they can be very helpful. I think they're more helpful once you've done kind of an overall, once you've made some changes to help you get those little changes. I think if you're at the beginning of your journey, it may be a bit overwhelming, but so there's lots out there free. We also hired a consultant and we did that through a TIG grant. So I know that's not something that everybody can do, but I will say that it was way less than I thought it would be. So I don't know how much, I'm happy to talk to you guys about that afterwards. I wasn't involved with the consultant, but if you're wondering like what's a price range for how much that would cost. Then we also conducted user testing, and that's with people who are using assistive technologies, users with all arrays of disabilities and abilities, and just seeing how people use your website is mind-blowing. Like it really is like, wait, I never thought you would go there first. Like, why are you doing that? It helped in so many ways. I cannot recommend doing it enough. And filming I'm paying people, of course. So test. So those were the kind of the 3 approaches we took. And then the next slide is a bunch of the free tools. And then there just are so many, they're very specific. If you have a specific problem, there is probably a specific tool for it. I would say the w3.org's website, you can filter by like, what kind of tool are you looking for this issue? And that is really helpful in evaluating your website. So the next slide. So once you have all of these, you're recognizing the problems, what do you do? Well, get real. Some of you may be programmers and developers, and some of you may be on the content side, which is where I am. And, you just have to have a real good working relationship. So they're going to be, I will say that this process took us a very long time. It took us doing all of the content. We touched every piece of content, everything on our website. We worked with Pro Bono Net and Law Help and really, fixing a lot of things, making a lot of changes. So it's a long process. But, there are things that a programmer can do, like, maybe like the ARIA attributes. And those are the things that basically tell people what elements on your website do, so that people with screen readers know, like, oh, this is a menu and it's one that if I click on it, it will expand, and this is what that does. So that's something a programmer can only do. Maybe work on the color contrast, like that's something. But as content managers, there are a lot of kind of grunt work kind of things that are already built into your most definitely are already built in to your platform, your website platform, that you just need to be using and using correctly. So those are things like bulleted list, right? If you're using the bulleted list format that is within your content management system, like it will tell somebody using a screen reader, this is the first part of a list. This is the last part of, this is the last item in a list, so that if somebody who is not, who is looking at your website can tell that's what that content is. So, so you just need to, things like that. So using alt text for photos, using descriptive text links. So instead of it's just being like, to go to the HUD website, click here, you say like, find this visiting the HUD website, and that is your link. So things like that, offering accessible PDFs, or if you know how to make PDFs accessible and you're good at that, God love you. I would love to talk to you, but or offering HTML or some kind of accessible alternative. So any PDF we have on our website, we also then have it transcribed and in a PDF form, or in an HTML form, which is tedious, but it also, we didn't have the time and money and expertise to make these PDFs that have been around for forever accessible. So any videos, all your videos need to be, have transcripts, be closed captioning. They need to, it needs to indicate where your transcripts, that there is a transcript before the video starts playing. We also use narration on all of our videos. So things like that. Those are things that as a content manager, you can do. And all of that, if you look on the toolkit, these solutions are all available, and they're made very specifically for, you can find exactly how to do it if you have a Drupal or a Law Help website. So so the next one, so once you have made those changes, test again, this is the second test, like audit your website, do user testing again, use those free online accessibility tools again, and do that periodically. Make that, every 6 months, once you've made these changes, look at what is happening now. Because any change you make to your website, it may affect how people using assistive technology are viewing your website, and you may not know. So once we did all of this, which was a big undertaking, we then created a style guide that incorporated these accessibility standards. And that way, it was a way to evaluate anything else that goes on our website. So now we do not put anything on our website that does not meet these standards. And so, sometimes we'll have to say, like, an attorney will be like, we want to put this form up. And we'll be like, okay, if we can find it somewhere else, maybe we can link to it there. But like, we're not putting this crazy PDF up on our website. That's the video content. So this is how our videos look on our website. So they have the transcript, they're embedded in their YouTube videos that are embedded, which YouTube has closed captioning. And they also have captioning and narration. So, and a transcript there. So all of those things, which may seem redundant, but they also are, you never know how somebody is accessing your information. And then actually, so we had a bunch of guided interviews that we wanted to be on our website, but because the documents created are PDFs, we were concerned that people who are using screen readers weren't able to preview and review their documents before they were downloaded and printed out. And so that was part of our TIG project with Callie and HJ, and Jessica's going to talk about that. So, yeah.
Cool, thank you. Okay, I am Jessica Frank. I am A to J Authors project manager, mid-30s, blonde, Caucasian woman, pronouns she, her, hers. And I am going to talk about how we incorporated all of what the previous presenters have talked about into our document assembly platform. Not all of it, but how the lessons we've learned by working with Sally and Atlanta Legal Aid and Luigi and Lone Star have made accessibility improvements to our tool. And so my presentation here is going to kind of broken into two camps, and I'll be switching back and forth between things that you can do as content creators and as authors, and things that we can do as the software provider. So that's split into sort of how Sally was saying. There is stuff that you can do the grunt work and making sure things are presented in consistent ways, and then there are things that we have to do on the back end of the software. And so one of the easiest ways that you can kind of dip your toe into accessibility is defining legal concepts. So many of us are legal professionals. We understand a lot of the words like petitioner and respondent, but those aren't who the users of guided interviews or a lot of our self-help tools are. And so sometimes, like Luigi said, there is a legally relevant word. You have to know if somebody is the petitioner or the respondent, but that's not something that someone with a 5th grade reading level or maybe a high school education or English isn't their first language, they're not going to understand that term. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to define it. And we have tools here. What I'm showing is called a pop-up. It is a just-in-time learning feature that allows you to provide that definition at the point in which the word is presented to the end user. And if you define it once, you create this pop-up once, throughout your interview, when you use that word again, you can reuse the same content to sort of remind the end user. And this screenshot is showing the pop-up up and presenting to the end user, but you can see that it just says, are you the petitioner or the respondent? And petitioner is a blue link. And so if they know that word, they don't have to click on it. So it's not imposing additional content for them to read. Only if they need that additional information can they click on it and get those terms. Thanks to a grant we did in March of 2022 with Lone Star, we were able to add all of the multimedia components that are in our Learn Mores, which I'll talk about in a second, into pop-ups, including a lot of accessibility enhancements. And sorry, that screen or the GIF is a little wonky here, but this is just showing that you, in addition to that text of adding a definition, you can also add a video, audio, you can add graphics to your pop-ups, you can add the alt text images, you can add transcripts. This one shows video transcripts, and it shows the transcript that's there. You can expand the video, you can pause it, you can stop it. All of the things that we've built in during our accessibility audit that we did in 2018, which again, I will talk about, thanks to Luigi's organization, have been added to pop-ups as well. So that gives an additional place to use that multimedia content that you might want. Another important component for accessibility is language access, and we support 16 languages within A to J Author. So we've done the work of translating the Chrome of the interview, the things that are common to all interviews. So back, next, continue, exit, like that kind of stuff, the stuff that wraps around every interview. We've done those translations into these 16 languages, and we also support the characters if they're not expected on a keyboard, that kind of thing. But we leave the content translation to you as authors because we don't believe in using like a Google Translate or automatically translating legally relevant materials. So we leave that to you as the content creators to ensure that you've done the plain language review in English, and then you can move that into whatever language you want. With another grant from Lone Star Legal Aid, we were able to translate our a2j.org site, which is our hosting site provided by Callie, my organization, into Spanish and Vietnamese as well as English. So the entire site is translated for the end user, and so they can get an end-to-end experience. They come from Lone Star's website in Spanish or Vietnamese. they are taken to the landing page of a2j.org, and they see in the language that they're continuing on, like here, for example, is Vietnamese, and then they can then run the interview itself in Vietnamese. So it keeps the whole transition process. There's not this weird break in the middle where all of a sudden they're presented with an English like terms of service and how do I access this website? And so that is important to us as well, to have the content available in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. If you are doing work in another language and you are interested in hosting with us and having the content translated, we have sort of the set text that we worked with the WeJuice organization, and it was a relatively smooth, hopefully, process to get that going in. And I'm writing a lot of checks that Tobias and Terejo, our backend developer, will have to write. So, feel free to come to us with programs when you want Tobias to do stuff. So some of the magic of an A2J guided interview comes with what we call these just-in-time learning features. And these include things that we call learn mores in addition to those pop-ups, which I talked about. So learn mores are a way to give your end user additional content and information at the point in which they need it, that just in time. These can be explaining legal concepts, so more than just a definition. Maybe you're explaining something procedural that you're breaking out. Maybe you're in the screenshot, here's an example, maybe you're saying like, make sure at the end to sign your document, and you have a picture of the document with an arrow that says like sign here. Or if the question is like, what judicial district are your proceedings in? And someone's like, how would I know that? Well, take a picture of what a normal form looks like and have an arrow pointing like, look here to find out what your case number is or what the judicial district is, something that end users wouldn't necessarily know where to find that on things they may have with them. Learn mores can also can be simple text as shown here. They can be a graphic. They can be a video, and it can be all three of them. It can be audio. There's a lot of different content that can be added in a learn more. These are two real world examples of learn mores. So this one came out of Florida. So they are using an example of the question was something like, do you want to deliver, I think it's deliver via email? Obviously I can't see in the background. And the question was like, why would I want to do that? And they're explaining procedurally, like, here's why you might want to do it. It might be easier to get it, via email, but carefully read, and here's a link out to the statute because you might want that additional information. This is another one where if you need detailed instructions on finding your generated documents, here's how you actually do it. Here in our e-filing system, in our portal, is where you can find whatever I'm asking you for at the point. I think the interview said you're going to need some additional documents, and then this is telling them where to find it. So these are real world examples where organizations are using Learn More to give additional help at the point in which the end user needs it. So they can, here's an example, just a silly example of a video, but within the video, this is the things that we can do on the software side. So as Sally talked about, adding media labels or alt tags to your graphics, to add transcripts to it. And a lot of this it's very easy to do. So like the graphic alt text is supposed to be 100 characters or less with no punctuation. It really is 3 seconds of writing out, picture of a dog, picture of a cat, whatever, a document. And transcripts don't have to be super labor intensive either. There are tools that you can use to create the transcripts. I think YouTube, you can actually download the captions that have been put into videos. So if you're using something like that, you can download that and put it in there. Media labels, is it supplemental? Is it something that someone should, if they watch the video or if they read the content that's on the screen, should they also then watch the video, or is it just an alternative? So you have the video or the media and it's saying the same thing in the text. So labeling those provides context for people who, it doesn't even matter in terms of if they're using a screen reader or whatever accessibility issues they might have. It's also good for people who don't necessarily identify as having accessibility issues, like, oh, I can skip this. This is just, it's alternative. Maybe I can't understand the speaker as well, or the audio isn't working, or it's the middle of the night and I'm feeding my baby and I don't want to turn the video on. Think of Instagram with the captions on, you're watching the videos and reading them because you don't want to wake up your sleeping baby that you're, nursing, that kind of thing. So it makes a big difference. It's for everybody, not just people who may have different abilities. So some of the things that authors can do, Sally touched on it, but in terms of document assembly, it's thinking about button placement and consistency. So in A to J, you can have up to 3 buttons at the bottom to move an end user around. But think about you as authors control what those buttons say. And so if by default it's going to say continue, but if you change it to something like the bottom one, is English your first language? Back, yes and no. One, we already have a back button at the top. So now that's just like repeating navigation, which isn't a great use of the space. But if in the first instance, you have a yes, no question and you have the yes first, and then 3 screens later, you have the no button first, that's confusing. And those are things that you can control when your subject matter experts are drafting the content. You can, if your subject matter expert is not the person doing the authoring and they hand you, a script that you're supposed to put into the interview, you can do a quick check of making sure buttons are consistently labeled. Some of the things that we can do as the software, we did an accessibility audit in the spring of 2018. We hired one of our developers that has worked on A to J in the past, a company called Batovi, to do an accessibility audit. And then we've spent the last now 4 years working through sort of that GitHub issue queue and working on different TIGs to handle accessibility in terms of the A to J viewer, what the end user is seeing, their interaction with the software, and then also with Atlanta Legal Aid this past year on the document assembly part of it. So in terms of things that we did as the software, when you get a phone number field and you're on a mobile device, because A to J guided interviews do run on mobile devices, and we do have a special interface for the mobile experience that is pared down, doesn't have the avatars, the courthouse, it is mobile first. On that experience, when you hit like a phone number or a number field, instead of the QWERTY keyboard popping up, have things like the number keyboard pop up, and then somebody doesn't have to click over, to the number and switch over. Little things like that. Color contrast we talked about. So we have colors within A to J author, like you must type a response in the highlighted space before you can continue, and it's a warning. Part of our accessibility audit was sharpening the contrast to make sure that there was a bigger difference for those who may be colorblind, and also it just generally looks better when your colors are sharper on the web. The tabbing through, so that was a big thing because our interview sits in sort of a weird context that's unexpected from normal interactions with a screen reader. And when we were initially doing this, I bought the JAWS license, the screen reader, and I put it on my computer and I ran through it. And it was terrible. Like JAWS is already hard to use if you aren't used to using it or aren't expecting it. But to have the I didn't know where I was going. I couldn't move around. The navigation was terrible. And so one of the big things we did was adding the ability to tab through different sections and adding those ARIA labels that say like, this is, one modal is asking the questions. This is a different kind of modal. How do you move between the two? How do you start at the top and you can skip the navigation and go into the question. And when I tab, it goes to the continue button. And I actually find that I use tabbing a ton now, where I was like, that seems like I don't use my mouse, whatever. No, I tab all the time. It's fantastic. So if you aren't tabbing in A to J author, get to that. This is some of the stuff we had in the software. We had the ability to pause videos, to expand them. But you can control volume is important things we did to the software, the ability to play it back, to pause it, to start it again. This is my 2-year-old running through the Christmas tree farm this year. Some other stuff we did are the compatibility. So we focused heavily on screen readers, and we did user testing with people who use screen readers on a regular basis, unlike my terrible JAWS experience. And so things like adding the ARIA labels, making sure attributes were there, that they were used correctly, that things had headings, that headings were clear, all that kind of stuff. We worked through a whole queue of issues during the summer of 2020. That is how we spent our COVID time doing that. These are just more examples of like icons saying the correct thing. If there is an icon like the A to J author logo, it can be ignored. It's not actually essential to the content. And so just marking if they're visual things, if they are necessary to understand the content, or if they are just, decorative. Explanatory text for next buttons, like explaining that it in our navigation, not in the buttons that you all are creating for moving people around, but on the Chrome that's in every interview, the back, the next, explaining that this is a next. It's going to take them to the next step or the next question. Same aria here. So we worked with Atlanta Legal Aid this past year on a TIG, past year and a half, on a TIG to take our document assembly templates and make a preview option for end users who might be using a screen reader that is in HTML. So A to J Author can be used as a front end with other tools like HotDocs or other e-filing systems, case management systems, that kind of thing. We also have our own back-end tool, which is called the DAT, the Document Assembly Tool, A to J DAT. And so this focused on accessibility related to the DAT because that's what we can control. We know how it takes all the user's information and how their information is stored and then how the document is produced. We have control over the whole process. And so we limited the focus of our grant with Atlanta to just be on text templates because it was a unique way that the templates are created and that they already were in HTML before they became a PDF. So we basically inserted a step into the process where it says you have documents that can be previewed, open document preview. And when they do, a HTML representation of that document is displayed to the end user. And so they can see what their final document, this is a very simple example, it only has one variable of the name, but they can see what their final document would look like before it becomes that PDF, which might be more difficult for their screen reader to deal with. This is just another example. Like, it's very short. These aren't, the A to J DAT text templates are meant for simple documents. So like motions, simple letters, explanations of next steps. They're not necessarily heavily formatted court forms that you have to, keep it on this little box and this caption has to be at the top and your court has a terrible PDF. We have another tool for that. These are things that you have more control over. So more of like I'm making it from Word or Google Docs that can be replicated in the text preview. And then to make PDFs less terrible, I did a deep-ish dive, but into making PDFs more accessible, and we created a best practices guide. So it also is linked. The slides are on Whova. We made some changes, so I will update the Whova slides after this presentation. It's also on our website under the Learn tab. Best practices guide for making PDFs accessible. Adobe Pro, it's expensive, but it has a lot of great tools built in. So I think their yearly membership is like $250 and I'm sure you can get sort of better pricing if you're buying better quantities and that kind of stuff. What? Oh yeah, okay. But our best practices guide walks through and has a lot of screenshots, and there's just a lot, like literally there's a button in Adobe Pro that you can click and it's like make accessible, and up will pop all the kinds of things that you can change that are very simple. So at least you're making it slightly better than it was, if nothing else. Check out the best practices guide and it's not just for A to J guided interviews, it is for any document assembly tool that might be starting with a PDF. Or any PDF. We didn't necessarily tailor it to our tool specifically for that. So we did really well on time. And so we have time for questions or comments. I will bring Ariadna back up, hopefully. She's still, oh, no.
She's gone.
The baby must have needed something. Yeah. So if you do have questions, feel free. Welcome.
Hi, so I don't know if this is working. I'm a communications team of one, and I was just wondering how you all internally combat the type of somebody sends you something in a very inaccessible format that day and is like, hey, can you post this content by tomorrow? Like, how do you internally have that conversation with your staff members to make them understand that there's a lot that goes into developing this?
As I said, we developed
a style guideline and accessibility standards, and then we just cite those and say, sorry, this is our standard. We're not putting anything on the website. I mean, we try to make that clear, like periodically, every couple months, hey, here's, if you want some community education to go out, or if you want me to do this, here's the guidelines. Also, if you want something to go up on this website, beyond just accessibility things, we have content that, because it became our website, as I'm sure anybody else who runs a statewide website, it can become just like a dumping ground for every lawyer who wants something to go up that they want somebody to be able to see. And so we really just very focused what we allow on the website, and it's very narrow. So that, my only advice is just to get very clear and then don't deviate. Unless it's an emergency, obviously, but, we don't put very many court forms that we can't then put in HTML. Like, we don't put a PDF court form because you can find them elsewhere. So that's just, you just gotta, I think you have to be clear on your own standards and then have someone to back you up.
Is that you or Kristen saying like no, or is it coming from higher up where like your organization or like your ED has said like, I get this and now it's a priority? Or someone just being like, nope, I'm going to be a stick in the mud. I'm not doing this.
Yeah, it's usually me, but Kristen, who is my boss, will also back me up. And I think that in general, because we are, we have put so much work into this website. We've done so much like content changeover and getting it to a place where it is usable and I think accessible, and just, so that it's a good tool. Like, we're just not willing to like put anything on it that's not going to be usable. So, because I feel like it's a really slippery slope. And I feel like, people like us, where we don't have a lot of support, like we turn over so quickly that you have to have some kind of guidelines so that the next person who comes along can also know how to put content up on your website and know how to, so that's, good luck.
To ensure that you're meeting compliance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So that anybody who is putting something on will be able to meet those standards.
And we, even as a disability organization, have had that issue, right? Same thing. Attorneys want something up, but we have an internal process. Okay, your lack of planning is not our problem, right? So if this is your content, help us figure out what you need to make it accessible. And we have an ongoing term process, and we are not putting anything out there that is not accessible. So just that's the expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think my experience may be a little bit different because of where we are in the organization, we don't have like absolute control over what tends to go out. And so we initially did have to teach people, the value of stuff. We do include our practice groups as subject matter experts in the review, and then they get buy into the process and they can see the results of the user testing at the end of it. So we actually did a lot of internal outreach and built support that way from the ground up, because we can't tell people what to do. But, we did the pitch internally.
I agree. I found that with any project, doing it in reach is like perhaps the most important, getting buy-in from the organization and people in it who are going to use and recommend your tools. So.
Okay, so I have a question about breaking down information. We're a charity that does public legal education for Canadian employment legislation and Alberta employment legislation via presentations, social media, brochures, websites, and such. I think we do a pretty good job in breaking down each legislation into plain language, but I think where we fall through is that each legislation interacts with each other. So disability, you have insurance, WCB, the EI system, both federal and provincial disability benefits, all interacting with each other. And it's really crucial knowledge to know, because it can lead to overpayments and even cancellation of benefits. So I'm wondering how, and because you would need a base knowledge of each legislation, how would you approach kind of conveying something complex like that where they're interacting. Again, we'd hope that people would access our casework program in which we would assist with that, but a lot of the time, you know, we're meeting people once with these presentations and that's it.
Well, so what we did was we took the approach of, instead of trying to start with the source material and explaining the source material, we tried to figure out what are the tasks that people need to do as self-representing persons. And once we identified the things that people could do, then we sort of worked backwards from there and said, okay, what do they need to know to do that particular task? And then there would be things, you know, because we use an interview format, there would be times when we would find a place where we just couldn't adequately explain it, or we didn't think someone would be able to proceed, you know, as a self-representing person. And so we would send them to intake, or, you know, get them to come to your program because they would need that extra help. But we started from a task level and then worked backwards from there.
I think we kind of, with the same thing, you know, we had a lot of benefits in COVID that were reduced, right? Because we had all this additional benefits or entitlement that came through. So in looking at the cases that came through, it's like, okay, this was the outcome that we needed to address. But like you said, because it overlapped between our healthcare team, our Medicaid team, you know, so it was then you got to bring all the people to the table, the right people to the table to figure out, okay, what is the substantive message we need to get out and put it as simply and accessible as we can? Because in Texas, 3 million people are fixing to lose benefits. So that's something we're working on right now.
Links up near the top of the page that screeners can see and can jump directly to content. Like, ask it if y'all got any feedback on that. And then also specifically if your accessibility audit was just for the like end user interviews, or if it was also for the operating interface.
Yeah, so the first question was about skip links, the ability for the screen reader to skip the navigation, because generally it would hit the navigation at each page and then it would be maybe confusing, or it's difficult to go over that over and over again. So yes, we do have the ability to skip the navigation bar at the top. And so I believe once you're into the main content of the question, it will continue in that space that you are in. So when you click the continue button, it will keep it in sort of the question modal when you go to the next page. So we do have a skip link for the navigation at the top. The second question, sorry, remind me. Oh, right. Okay. So our funding was for the viewer, for the facing the end users. And so that is where we focused our initial work so the A to J author system has A to J author, the tool that makes the guided interviews. And then it has the A to J viewer, which is what plays the interviews for the end users. That's what you see with the avatars. We focused our work on the viewer specifically, because that was where we were going to have the most impact, and we had no control over who was going to see that content. We have some control over in terms of, we can tell our authors, this is best optimized in Chrome. These are the limitations that we have on the authoring side. Anybody running the viewer could be, anybody in the world, any viewer, any browser, any operating system, any sort of ability. And so that is where we spent the money on that. We have made improvements in terms of the authoring side on some of like the freebies and things that we learned from the viewer process to improve author, but we have not focused accessibility on author. If anyone wants accessibility in author and is thinking of writing a TIG, we would be happy to partner on that side. It's important to us, but right now we're working through the grant funding process. And that's why we focused with Atlanta. They were concerned about having the HTML representation before the preview part, and so that is where we focused. So the scope was on, we did the viewer part first, and then the next TIG project we worked on was on the viewer or on the DAT, the document assembly tool, and what we could control and what we could improve on limited resources. Yeah.
Have you found a good way to get user testing candidates or usability testing for people with disabilities? How do you find it?
I wasn't involved with that, but I believe that we worked with a community organization that helped us and that had clients that were using assistive technologies. But I can find that out if you want to come talk to me after. I can give you my card and give you a more specific answer. So
I would definitely say reach out to your P&A in the state, because that's going to be your wheelhouse to connect to all kinds of disability organizations at the local level, at the state level, whatever it is. I mean, because you've got different chapters for different organizations that represent specific disabilities, right? Federation of the Blind. Protection and Advocacy Agency. So there's a network. There's one in every state and territory in the U.S. So, like, I'm Disability Rights Texas. There's a Disability Rights Louisiana, Florida, North Carolina. I mean, everywhere. So that would be the agency to start with to see if you can connect.